This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Professor Abdeslam Maghraoui takes your questions on the popular uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. Maghraoui is an associate professor of the practice in the Department of Political Science and is also a member of the Duke Islamic Studies Center. He is the author of Liberalism Without Democracy, Nationhood and Citizenship in Egypt, 1922 through 1939. And this semester, he is teaching the course Introduction to Middle East Politics. To ask Maghraoui a question, send an email to live@duke.edu. Tweet with the tag DukeLive, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
Welcome to Duke University Office Hours. My name is Jeffrey Mock. I'm with the Duke Office of News and Communications, and in my volunteer capacity, I serve as Egypt Country Specialist for Amnesty International USA. Today's topic is Egypt and the uprisings throughout the region in the Middle East and North Africa. I'll be here with Professor Abdeslam Maghraoui, Associate Professor of Political Science at Duke, and he's currently teaching a class on Introduction to Middle East Politics, a class for which he is frantically rewriting the lectures to keep up with the current events. And in a few minutes, we'll be talking with one of his former students, Andrew Simon, a 2010 Duke graduate who was in Cairo during the protests and can provide an eyewitness account. Please, we invite all viewers to send in questions through Facebook, Twitter, or by email at live@duke.edu. Professor Maghraoui, let's start with the uprising in Egypt. Although it took people by surprise, these protests did not come out of nowhere. Can you set the background for what happened and explain why now?
Well, what we see across the region is really the result of profound social and political problems that have been brewing for decades. Social problems are huge. Chief among them is the problem of unemployment, especially among the younger populations. Across the region, the young segments of the population constitute about like 35 to 40% of the population, and they are the hardest hit by the problem of unemployment. In parallel to that, we have the problem of political participation. Basically, most of the regimes in place rule through iron fist. There are no possibilities for expression. There has been serious problems of human rights. So the two combined to lead to what we see today in the region.
And what's the current situation in Egypt? The military has established a military council to take power. Who's ruling and what's happening now?
My sense is that we are still in a revolutionary moment. It's not over yet. I think it's a bit too early to talk about transition. The military has taken certain measures. They closed down the parliament. They are drafting a new constitution. However, there are some signs that are disturbing. One, many protesters are still detained. Political prisoners have not been released. This is a chief demand of the people who are protesting. Emergency laws have not been lifted. They promised to hold elections within 6 months, but in my sense, we are still really in moments of flux. I mean, the military has very entrenched socio-economic interests, and also they are part of the political organizations. They have been, part of the political system. So we might see a lot of discussions within the military on how far they might want to go. But they are aware at the same time that the youth movement is very serious about reforms. They are not going to stand for less than what they're asking for.
Why do you think the military pushed President Mubarak out? That didn't happen in other countries, such as Iran. It did happen in Tunisia. But what was the circumstances, do you think, that they felt comfortable and that necessary to push President Mubarak out?
Well, I think at some point they realized that the momentum, the mass movement was not going to slow down, that there were moments of hesitation. And they did not use overwhelming force. We were fairly peaceful in controlling the demonstrations. Nonetheless, they have to look out after their own interests. I mean, they realized at some point that Mubarak was over, that they want to project themselves as the military, not of Mubarak or particular regime, but they are the army of the Egyptian people. I think the attitude of the demonstrations in Tahrir Square also encouraged them, because they opened up to them, they looked out for them as if they are going to be the guardians of the change.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you heard a lot from the protesters was in the steps up to President Mubarak's resignation was, we have lost our fear. And I'm interested, this may be best for a psychiatrist or a psychologist. How is it that after all these years of demonstration, at that moment, the people lost the fear and did not go back to their homes? They stayed out there and forced it out. Why now?
Yeah, I think this is really an interesting question, and a lot of people are talking about the role of the social media, which is very important. But I think the psychological aspect is much more important. And it's not certain that Egypt will have happened, the revolution in Egypt will have happened if we didn't have the change in Tunisia. I mean, Tunisia was a breakthrough, psychological breakthrough, showing that people can by themselves walk in the street, demonstrate, and they can topple a regime. It never happened in the past, since independence. And so it was not the army, it was not some foreign intervention, it was the people themselves. And that really reassured the demonstrators that they can do it as well.
Now, President Mubarak seemed to pull from his old playbook and kept on trying to blame foreign interests on the demonstrators. And he also referred to the protesters as his children, repeatedly. What do you think that said about the political relationship in Egypt?
Well, I think it tells me that many of the autocrats in the region are really out of touch. I don't think they understand the level of anger that is going on. And across the region, similar in Qatar, in Iran, in Algeria, we say the same tactics. First, to say, well, there are foreign hands that are really involved with this. Then try to buy out the protesters by providing some symbolic concessions. They don't realize the level of anger of the people, and it's not just about food. I mean, this is about dignity, about freedom and participation. And this is really something that the autocratic regimes will have to realize, that this is not just about handing out food to the people.
If I could take you back to this past Thursday, when for a day news reports were coming out that Mubarak was going to resign. And then he goes on television, state-run television, and he gives this message that I'm not going anywhere. What were you thinking when you saw that?
Well, it was in a way, pathetic thing to see. I mean, the speech was really badly crafted, and he simply seemed very disconnected. I think he was confused. I mean, later we learned that he was getting really some very bad advice and the wrong information about what's going on. He was told that the Muslim Brotherhoods were behind this, that were foreign hands, his own Minister of the Interior. So he was, and also within his own household, I think that there was a lot of pressure from his son not to give up so early, because his own son had ambitions, and he was trying to encourage him to stay. So I think that reflects all of this kind of dynamic within the household.
Of course, the questions that are going through Washington right now is, what do we do with U.S. policy? For decades, it was based on just having this particular relationship with the Egyptian military and with President Mubarak. But now they have to deal with civil society actors and building up civil society. What should be the basis of U.S. policy now in the new Egypt?
Well, I think the traditional diplomacy based on stability, oil, and security is no longer sustainable. I mean, it proved that it is disastrous. I mean, that ignoring what people in the region want will be a strategic mistake. I understand that the United States, the government, is going to have strategic interest and it's not going to give them up. However, I think there has to be some serious commitment to the principles of human rights and democracy in concrete way, not just through words. And that's something that has to be introduced in the equation of foreign policy in the region.
Now, at the same time that the protesters were out there, WikiLeaks was leaking documents that indicated pretty strongly that behind, excuse me, that behind the scenes, State Department and U.S. government officials were pressing Egyptians on human rights, not very successfully. Mm-hmm. Why do you think they weren't successful at that time with all the financial aid that we gave?
Well, I think that, I mean, Egypt is a very important country for the peace treaty with Israel. Mm-hmm. U.S. leverage is great, but not that great. It's not limitless. I mean, there is only so far you can push on in terms of reforms. And Mubarak regime was convinced that they are stable, that there is this very different situation than Tunisia, and that nobody's going to lecture Egyptians on question of democracy. Mm-hmm. I think that the Iraq disaster, or I mean the situation in Iraq was really played in the hands of the autocratic regime. This was basically, you want democracy, look at what's going on in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And they used that as a way to push back on democratic reforms.
Okay. We're going to go now to Andrew Simon, who, as I mentioned, is a former student of Professor Maghraoui's and was in Cairo, was an eyewitness to the protests. And Andrew, I'd like you to go back to the day that it was announced that President Mubarak had resigned and just give me a feel for what that was like.
It was basically just genuine euphoria, complete joy. People had just essentially had enough when President Mubarak kept making concession after concession, appointing Amr Suleiman, appointing Ahmed Shafiq. There was a sign in Tahrir that I'll always remember that said, La Mubarak, no to Mubarak. And then someone wrote on it, La Suleiman, no to Amr Suleiman after he was appointed. And then someone wrote, La Shafiq Kaman, and no to Shafiq also. So that basically just shows that the students or the protesters were calling for a universal rejection, the complete fall of the regime, which is yet to take place in full. But when Mubarak finally announced his resignation, it was just complete joy and happiness that the main goal, uniting everyone in the square and cities across Egypt, had finally been accomplished.
Now, what's been the aftermath like? And have you seen a change in political culture?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of factors still up in the air. People are wondering who's going to come into power. But I think one thing to consider is not who is just maybe elected, but also the process through which said candidates are going to be elected. If we remember the most recent elections in Egypt, the oppositional parties only won a handful of parliamentary seats, which they later willingly forfeited to protest the rampant fraud that took place. So I think it's just a general restructuring of the system before looking at individual candidates that may run in the upcoming elections.
I guess this is a question for both of you. I mentioned earlier that President Mubarak referred repeatedly to the people of Egypt as his children. I wonder if you could ever see the Egyptian people seeing themselves as the children of a political leader again. Has that changed irrevocably?
Well, I mean, paternalism has been part of the political culture of the autocratic leaders in the region. They said, "Oh, we'll consider all of you our children. We care for you." But I think the protesters in the street wanted none of that. I mean, they wanted some real concrete reforms. Mm-hmm. They wanted to hear, okay, these are the steps that we are going to take: reform the constitution and do the parliament, recognize the political system. And he was like completely disconnected from what the people really in the streets want. And that's one of the problems. They simply are not in touch with the realities out there.
One of the main things in the Arabic broadcast was just pointing out how out of touch President Mubarak actually was after his final speech, and essentially having the audacity to tell the protesters to go home, to return to their houses. A lot of commentators were just pointing out what they call in Arabic a fajwa lughawiyya, sort of like a linguistic gap in between the reality on the ground across all these cities with millions of people in Tahrir and sort of the fantasy world that President Mubarak was portraying and was talking about.
Andrew, who were the people in the streets? You heard a lot of different concerns about who was out there, but did you see specific groups dominating?
Yeah, so it really changed. On the 25th, the first day of protest, it was mostly middle-class, highly educated youth that were leading the front. And then as the protest went on and gained momentum, really all people from all walks of life started coming out. There were reports of Muslim Brotherhood members. I saw women bringing their children in strollers into the square. There were little kids. There were, elderly citizens. But most of all, people were there as Egyptians. They weren't affiliating with any type of religious creed, any social background, any class. And there were signs that said, Christians and Muslims are one. We're Egyptians first and foremost, independent of, our diverse backgrounds. So really everyone came out eventually.
Yeah, can you just jump in? Yeah, I think what is really new about this new protest that we see across the region is really the absence of any political parties, trade unions, or organized groups, at least in the beginning. These are like across, the board coalitions made of young people, including some of the Muslim Brotherhoods. I mean, the old leaders of the Muslim Brotherhoods were not present in Tahrir Square in the beginning. So it's very heterogeneous ideologically, and only later on did we see other people joining political parties, trade unions, and families. But this is really very interesting phenomenon where it's basically led by young people.
I'd like to get a sense from both of you, the role of social media that played. It obviously played an important part, but yet, as Andrew mentioned, you had grandmothers out there, you had family members out there, people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be checking Facebook a lot. So in the long run, what could this have happened without social media?
Yeah, I think we are going to debate these questions for the next few years. What is really the role of the social media? My sense is that the conditions that led to this problem were brewing for years there. What was needed is really a spark, and that spark is never expected. I mean, it could happen anytime. In Tunisia, nobody expected that this young unemployed was going to set himself on fire, and that's going to start a revolution in Tunisia. So I think the social media definitely played a role, but there are moments where for example, the internet was cut off completely in Egypt, and yet the momentum of the movement did not lighten up. So it's something that we'll be talking about.
Well, Andrew mentioned the Muslim Brothers, and I know anytime I wrote about the protests, I got a response, "You fools! It's Tehran, 1979, all over again." What's going to be the difference between this Egyptian revolution and what happened in Iran, if there is going to be a difference?
Oh, there are huge differences. First of all, I mean, this is basically what is going on in Egypt and in Tunisia is basically about domestic issues. It does not concern the United States. It does not concern Iraq or Israel. It is ideologically heterogeneous. I mean, there are different groups. There are left liberals, there are Muslim Brotherhoods, there are secular. It's very, very heterogeneous. And the Muslim Brotherhoods played a role. I mean, at least the young wing of the Muslim Brotherhood played a role in terms of defending the barricades, in terms of providing the supplies to Tahrir Square, food and water at some point. But the leaders are aware that this is not an Islamic movement. I mean, they have already said they are not going to present a president for somebody in the president's elections. They are aware that the people guiding the protest want a diverse political landscape. So I don't think this is going to be like Iran 1979.
Okay. Andrew, did you see any feeling about the Muslim Brothers during the protests?
Not particularly. I mean, contrary to President Mubarak's warnings to the West that the Muslim Brotherhood was leading the revolution and this would usher in a sort of a new era of Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt, Islam and religion at large was basically absent in the protesters' chants and demands. Again, everyone was just calling for the downfall of the regime. There was no chance of, Islam is the solution. So I didn't see a very large sort of like Muslim Brotherhood presence in Tahrir, at least in the beginning. I mean, it grew over time. But once again, like Professor Maghraoui said, the Muslim Brotherhood was by no means leading this revolution. This was a people's grassroots movement.
Just a reminder to our viewers that you can send in questions through Facebook, through Twitter, and by email at live@duke.edu. And we have an email question here from Stuart for Professor Maghraoui. Do you see any danger that new leadership in Egypt and elsewhere in the region could set back the advances made by women in some countries?
I really doubt it. I mean, if anything, I saw the more women participating in demonstration both in Tunisia and in Egypt. I mean, in the end, it's going to depend on what final constitutions are going to adopt and what kind of governments. But from all signs that we see, this is not some kind of closed-minded movement that's going to disenfranchise women. Quite the opposite. I think I'm much more hopeful that we'll see more participation by women in the region.
Okay. And let's broaden the discussion some to the other countries in the region, because following the Egyptian revolution, uprising, we've had incidents in Libya, Algeria, Yemen, Jordan, and elsewhere. And do you see it spreading significantly beyond Egypt?
It is very possible. I mean, I think we are going to see demands for the democratization or democratic reforms across the region. Mm-hmm. One thing about these authoritarian regimes in the region, they don't look alike at all. This is unlike Eastern Europe, where you have the one-party system, where you have the ideology very similar. Each authoritarian system has its own specific characteristics, and it's going to be extremely difficult to predict how or what's going to be the impact on each one of these. Mm-hmm. But I can think of like 3 countries that already are, we see some movements there: Bahrain, Libya, and Yemen. And what is really interesting about these 3 countries is they are completely diverse from each other. Bahrain is very, have a GDP of one of the highest in the world, I mean $40,000 per capita. Libya is a medium kind of country, $15,000, and then Yemen, $2,500. So the diversity does not tell us about which countries are going to follow the path of democratization. In addition to that, different regimes rely on different institutions. Some rely on tribes, some rely on military, some on police force, some have strong Islamic movements, some have weak. So it really depends. The dynamic is going to change. I mean, the outcome is going to depend on the actors within these countries. Mm-hmm.
And the reaction of some of these autocrats and monarchs to the Egyptian uprising was pretty interesting. I think the Saudis were offering anything they could to President Mubarak to remain in power. Do you see any change of policy of the Arab countries in foreign policy and in their relationship to each other? In other words, is the next meeting of the Arab League, I guess, is going to be pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think definitely the pressure for reform is going to be on the agenda. I mean, and some of them are recognizing the need to address, the demands of the people. But the initial reaction across the countries that I have seen is first to deny that they are similar to Tunisia. I mean, when there was a revolution in Tunisia, Egypt was repeating again, Egyptian officials that, oh, Egypt is so different from Tunisia. And yet only a month later, look what happened. And the same thing in Morocco, in Algeria, where we're different from Tunisia and Egypt. So the first reaction is to deny. Then try to buy out. I mean, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, they have a lot of money at their disposal. They're going to try to spend, thousands of dollars for its citizens to try to buy time. But in the end, ultimately, I think that they realize that this is not just about food, as I said, or unemployment. It's also about political participation, about political rights, about human rights, and they will have to be addressed. There are going to be some holdouts: Syria, Iran, Algeria. These are going to be the hardest nuts to crack because they have strong repressive apparatuses at their disposal. They are really used to this kind of demonstrations. In Algeria, they have gone through a civil war during the 1990s. In Iran, the revolutionary guards can be very repressive. The same thing in Syria. In the 1980s, basically, Assad destroyed the whole town, Hama, and where like 20,000 people were killed. So we're going to be seeing some, countries that are going to hold on for a while. They might not give it so easily.
And the government of Israel, they're obviously rather nervous now about what's happening in Egypt. What would you recommend that both Egypt could do to soothe that nervousness, and what they should be looking towards long term in Israel?
Well, I think that any peace that is built across peoples rather than just governments or heads of states is much more secure peace. I think that Israel should really reach out to the revolution in Egypt and to say, we understand your needs. We hope to maintain lasting peace and strong relationship. But I think that the initial reaction of Netanyahu was very negative and very concerned about what's going to take over. But ultimately, I think Israel will have to realize that there's going to be change in the region. And it might serve the interest of Israel that he can establish long-lasting peaceful relationship with the people, not just with the government. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a lot of negotiation and bargaining, but at the same time, it's much more promising than having the peace process in the hands of one single ruler who, once he disappears, everything might fall down.
And in Gaza, that was also, we haven't mentioned that, but that was the one place where you've also seen a little bit of political activity. Do you expect the Egyptian uprising to affect the Palestinians?
Yeah, that's a tricky situation. When we talk about the Palestinians, we're talking about two authorities. In Gaza, basically, the Hamas is extremely excited about the change in Egypt. Egypt had maintained a policy that pretty much was blockade the Palestinians in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is in very difficult situation because there is no progress on the peace front. There is no concrete result. And they have their own problems of corruption. Elections have been delayed for so long. We might see some people have already walked in Ramallah in the streets and asking for their own revolution against the Palestinian Authority.
The economy. We've got a question here about the economy. The Egyptian economy you mentioned was heavy unemployment. How is that? Is that not an obstacle to moving forward in creating on the path towards political reform in Egypt?
Oh, yes, that's definitely. Egypt is going to, first of all, the social problems are so deep that it's going to take at least 10 years to address them. This is not going to be an easy thing to do. And in order to do that, they have to have a sound economy. Throughout the past 2 months, the economy has been wounded badly by the events, the protest. Egypt relies a lot on tourism, and then there are a lot of strikes going on. So it's going to be, I think that Egypt is going to need international support. And perhaps this could be a window of opportunity for the United States to exercise some leverage, that we are here to help you, and we hope that you are going to move forward, and also to perhaps dissuade the military from maintaining power for too long, to say, look, I mean, you are going to need the support of Europe, of the United States, and perhaps of China, but we'll see.
If you were advising the protesters or to talking to the military council, what do you say? These are the things you need to do.
Well, I think they should release the detainees, the protesters who are detained. I mean, they have been detained, and there's no words about them. They have to be detained. I mean, there is the risk that many of them might have been tortured by the military, not the police. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, that's going to be a huge problem, because the protesters want some kind of accountability. And if that mm-hmm. touches the high senior officers of the military, they are going to resist. So that's really a sensitive situation there. I would say also to release political prisoners mm-hmm. and to move forward to have very concrete program about what's going to happen next, the elections, the reforms of the electoral laws, and to show that they are not going to be there. That's it. They are going to hand the government to an interim government to organize the elections and move on.
That answer actually leads back to Andrew Simon. Andrew, if I wanted to see, what did you see in terms of the security forces' violence, and what were the ramifications for the protesters, and did anyone you know get detained?
No one that I know personally was detained. I had friends that were out at the protests in front of the Interior Ministry, and they witnessed people actually shot dead on the spot in front of the ministry, and their bodies being, towed away. In terms of in Midan Tahrir, in the square, on the 25th, the clashes were pretty violent because that's when the hated riot police were still out. There was a lot of stone throwing, tear gas canisters were being fired everywhere, flares were lit off. But as the protests went on and the army was deployed, it's important to remember that the Egyptian people essentially highly respect the army, love the army. The army was manning the checkpoints to enter the square. When people were going through, they were kissing army officers on their cheeks. They were taking photographs with them. They were handing their children to them to pose for pictures. So, but the army, they were also silent observers. And on the night of the major violence, Wednesday night, they basically stood by. Some officers were accused of not screening the pro-Mubarak supporters, who a lot of people think were essentially hired thugs to go in to interrupt the peaceful protesters, screening them for weapons. So they entered the square with knives, Molotov cocktails, and the army essentially couldn't do anything except stand by and watch. One of the photographs that went viral online that really catalyzed and mobilized more people to come out was an army officer just crying, watching the violence because he couldn't interfere, and a protester holding his head, basically telling him, "It's okay, we know that you can't do anything."
Andrew, what were the protesters asking for Mubarak? He's now apparently at this resort of his on the Red Sea. What do we think they're asking for in terms of justice? And is he going to live out the rest of his life quietly in the Red Sea?
I mean, I think they were just calling for his complete dismissal. I don't think they really cared what would happen after that. I mean, there were chants in the square saying, Mubarak, Mubarak, Saudi al-Intizarak, Mubarak, Saudi Arabia is waiting for you to leave the country. But I personally think that he's just going to stay in Sharm el-Sheikh. His health is failing. There was a report yesterday from BBC or another channel saying that he's refusing medical treatment. As he said in his speech, he wants to die in Egypt. But I think he's basically lost any type of sympathy vote from the people. He left, he's no longer president, and that's all they care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a point on this. I mean, I think in any process of transition to democracy, the democracy advocates will have to make sometimes hard choices between justice and making sure that the transition succeeds. And that is going to be the bargain they will have to strike, because the military, if the military is involved in big schemes of corruption, of torture, and of human rights, and if they think that eventually they are going to be held accountable for it, they are not going to want to give up power easily. So my sense is that at some point it's going to be heartbreaking, but at some point they'll have to come to a compromise and say, look, I mean, there are certain things we just have going to forget about for the sake of moving forward with democracy.
Just a reminder to our viewers, we can take questions from you either by email at live@duke.edu, through Facebook, or by Twitter. I wanted to throw out one comment because my favorite tweet of the day, and this goes to some of you of the protest, was that in the past people came to Egypt to go see the pyramids. In the future, they will come to visit Tahrir Square. And I guess, Andrew, I wanted to ask you, there must be a sense of pride in the Egyptian people now that they didn't have 3 weeks ago.
I mean, an incredible sense of pride. As President Obama pointed out, he was hearing Egyptians finally say, you know, we're worth something. You know, we really accomplished this. I mean, this was 30 years in the making of political frustration, of disenchantment. And finally, to see President Mubarak actually step down, a feat that many people thought would never be able to be accomplished. I mean, there's a great sense of pride, yeah.
Let's a question about President Obama. He mentioned him. There was a sense of disappointment that President Obama did not take a stronger stand, or some people thought he took a too strong a stand. What do you think, how would you have judged his performance during the 3-week period of the protests? And really, what options did you think he had?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for the Obama or any administration, it's a delicate balancing act between strategic ties that they had for so long with the regime in Egypt, with conflicting with commitments to democratic principles and ideals, and also the possibility of the kiss of death, that, well, if you openly endorse, I mean, if you say that Mubarak should step down, it can be used actually, and it has been used in some cases, that, okay, well, these are really agents of foreign manipulation. So, I mean, ideally, yes, I really wanted a very clear stand that Mubarak should step down, but I understand the hesitation. I mean, there are some concerns there, and I think overall, I would say that the Obama administration did pretty well handling the situation, given the uncertainty, given the conflict of interest and principles.
Andrew, what were people saying about the United States in Tahrir Square?
In my views, there were basically two camps. One of them said that the White House was towing the line for far too long, that they should have sided with the people much earlier. A lot of people were disappointed, especially after President Obama's speech at Cairo University a couple of years back, where he called for the youth to play a larger formative role in their governments. And here they were in the streets, and President Obama wasn't clearly, siding with them. The other camp essentially said that we don't really care what America has to say, what the West has to say, what any other country has to say. This is our revolution. We're leading it. We're going to decide the political future of our country, and we don't care what any foreign actor has to say about it.
Now, this is a question for both of you. The protest was a popular one, and it didn't really have much leadership. The media mentioned a couple names, a couple of times, of course. El Baradei is one, and the Google executive was another. How do you have an uprising without a leadership? I mean, and what's the consequences when it doesn't? At some point, don't you have to start selecting certain people to speak for you? How does that work?
Well, ironically, I mean, for me, the revolution succeeded in Tunisia and Egypt precisely because there was no leadership. Because when you have leadership, it is usually associated with already established political parties. Political parties have interest in governing, in power. They are much more willing to make compromises. I can imagine that if the protests in Tunisia were led only by trade unions and established political parties, they could easily strike a bargain and say, look, I mean, we are going to give you these seats in the parliament, we are going to give you these goods, and they were going to make concessions. Not with the young people protesting in the streets. They want serious political reforms. They want, they have very clear political agenda but not necessarily, they are not interested in power. In fact, many of them say that, okay, once this is over, I'm going back to my job. I'm not interested in politics.
We have a Twitter comment from Anne Marie. She is a history graduate student here at Duke who was living in Cairo until recently and is commenting on events in Twitter. And she said a journalist friend of mine avoided detention by running upstairs to hide in an apartment building and was detained a week later by the army in the first days of the protest before other journalists were targeted. Why do you think the Egyptian government targeted journalists and, as a matter of fact, the internet itself? And let me ask Andrew first. How did that impact the revolution, the uprising, by the attacks on the internet?
Well, I think they basically shut down the internet entirely, for several days. I believe it was 5 days or something, because they wanted to prevent images and videos from the revolution getting out. When I was walking throughout Tahrir, I had protesters come up to me and say, photograph this. These images need to reach the outside world. Photograph this, talk to us, report back to wherever you're from. But in the end, I feel that the Google executive, Wael Ghonim, his interview with CBS was just so telling recently, because he thanked the stupid Mubarak regime, in his words, for aiding the protesters when shutting down Facebook. It was a poor decision because the millions of Egyptians that were receiving word of the protests on Facebook in the comfort of their houses were then forced to go out into the streets and to see firsthand. So not only did the internet help galvanize and mobilize all the protesters, shutting down the internet also forced people into the street and gave the revolution even more, speed.
We have an email question from Elkan that goes a little farther beyond the region, but it interestingly shows there's potential beyond just the Middle East and North Africa. He's talking about neighboring Azerbaijan, and there has been some demonstrations there. The regime has been dominated by the same people essentially for 42 years, and there are many political prisoners. He said the scale of corruption is incredible. And the president is now trying for a life of presidency, abolishing term limits. Do you see anything that happening beyond the region because of the uprisings in the Middle East?
It's possible. I don't know the circumstances in Azerbaijan. However, one thing that emerges from what we see in the Middle East is that the idea of gradual democratic reforms might be losing its the merit. That in the end, the more political parties you involve, the more civil society you involve, the less likely you might have a breakthrough. And for the reason that I mentioned earlier, that they are much more willing to compromise. And there are moments in history where you simply have to stick to some of the political demands. This is not simply about how many seats we want in the parliament, or we want 3 ministerial posts, but this is about some basic fundamental principles of human rights, of political expressions and participation. And I think it could be a model to say, hey, look, these political parties have been in the opposition for so long. They haven't been able to accomplish anything. Perhaps people, for once, should try to take to the street and organize.
And I want to go back to U.S. policy and ask a question about how U.S. policy promotes human rights. Because one of the criticisms have been that we don't use a single standard. We will say to one country, such as Iran, you have to promote democracy. And then we may suggest that it should be more gradual in other countries if we and among our allies. If we are going to be successful in promoting human rights and democratic reforms, what should be the basis for U.S. policy to do that, to be effective?
Well, I mean, to consider human rights as fundamental rights of all people that they strive for. I mean, not to compromise with the leaders who are autocratic who oppress their citizens, to make it a fundamental component of U.S. foreign policy, and to isolate, basically not to deal with leaders who oppress their people. That's going to be tough. I mean, when you need security cooperation, when you need access to oil, but at the same time, in the end, you might end up with an unstable region if you overlook human rights issues.
Well, we have 100 viewers now, and there's time for a few more questions, so send them in through Facebook and Twitter and by email at live@duke.edu. Andrew, you say you want to go back to Cairo. What do you hope to see by going back there? I mean,
I'll be going back probably within 1 to 2 weeks' time. I'm really looking forward to, speaking with people after the fall of Mubarak, hearing their thoughts about the political future in Egypt. I look forward to returning to Tahrir, hopefully seeing a new, rejuvenated downtown. We were discussing before the show how a lot of people are sending out emails, invitations to come to Tahrir now and to really clean it up, to repaint the railings, to sweep the streets. Because right now people are really looking to move on and to rebuild Egypt, not only the political structure, but also on the ground and just to really rejuvenate the whole scene. So I'm looking forward to returning to that.
Well, I'm going to thank both of you. I'm going to give the professor the last question. Your book was, you wrote in 2005, was entitled Liberalism Without Democracy, Nationhood and Citizenship in Egypt. What do you think the title of your next book is going to be titled?
Well, no democracy without political participation, I guess. I mean, you can't have a democracy without people participating, and to go into the question, the idea that you need these institutions in order to have a democratic breakthrough. Sometimes basically you just need mass support.
We have one more question from Anne-Marie. Does Professor Maghraoui think a regional domino effect would move the U.S. to reform its policy towards Israel?
That's a hard question. I think that if these reforms are going to bring into place governments that are less willing to work with the United States. If the Palestinian issue is not resolved, I think the United States is going to have a big problem. And it might provide justification to say, look, I mean, this is unsustainable. We might have to work seriously about peaceful settlement.
Well, thank you both, Andrew Simon, 2010 Duke graduate who was in Cairo during the protests, and Professor Abdeslam Maghraoui, Associate Professor of the Practice of Political Science here at Duke University. Thank you both for joining us. A recording of this office hours, along with many other Duke videos, will be available on Duke On Demand. That is ondemand.duke.edu. And thank you for joining us.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.